Do you really believe that something no one saw could have been the greatest spiritual breakthrough of your life? That's right. Sometimes it's not the loud prayer or the grandiose gesture that changes everything, but that silent, discreet, almost invisible act capable of breaking chains that have held your soul captive for years. What seemed insignificant in the physical world was recorded by God as the most powerful act you've ever done. And I ask you, have you realized the true impact of that hidden choice? What is about to be revealed in this video is not for the curious, but for those who have the courage to face themselves in the mirror of faith. Have you ever caught yourself repeating patterns you swore you'd never repeat? Have you ever felt crushed by family stories that seem to haunt you like a shadow? Well, know this. There is a thin line between remaining bound or becoming the chosen one who broke centuries of invisible oppression. Here you will understand why that small decision, which almost no one valued, was recorded as a decree of freedom. By the end, you will see your own life with new eyes. You will understand how subtle movements can disarm enemies, undo ancestral contracts, and open new spiritual territories. You won't just grasp the logic of the invisible, you will feel that you are already living on a new frequency, as someone who has left behind a weight that didn't belong to you. The transformation that begins now is real. You will discover that silence can be louder than any shout, and that the invisible is the true stage where God recognizes His chosen ones. No one noticed when it happened. There was no audience, no applause, no post on social media. It was just an internal gesture, almost imperceptible, but so filled with faith that it shook dimensions human eyes cannot see. The natural world didn't move, but in the spiritual realm there was a profound upheaval. And it's curious how what man despises, God values as sacred. This silent movement didn't come by chance. It came from a heart that could no longer bear repeating the same cycles. Imagine someone who always reacted with shouts and arguments, but suddenly chooses serenity. It seems small, doesn't it? But that not reacting is like an earthquake in the invisible realm. It's at that moment that ancestral patterns which held generations in pain and sabotage begin to crumble. What stands out is how the invisible defies human logic. People love what is visible, grandiose, full of shine. But heaven responds to what is intimate, discreet, and often ignored. A silent plea for forgiveness, a prayer whispered in the middle of the night, a tear that falls when no one is watching. These have more power than a shouting crowd. God doesn't measure greatness by external intensity, but by the purity of intention. When He sees someone choose humility over pride or peace over vengeance, He records that choice as a spiritual milestone. It's as if an old contract were torn apart before His eyes. That's why the invisible carries so much weight. It's not about appearances, but about essence. This movement was so decisive that it made room for something new. It was as if an invisible key had turned, unlocking doors that had been closed for centuries. What seemed like just another ordinary day was recorded in heaven's calendar as the beginning of a new era. A simple act, but one that repositioned an entire lineage. And here's the most fascinating detail. No one saw, no one applauded, no one commented. But the invisible doesn't depend on human recognition. What matters is that in the spiritual world, that gesture was interpreted as a victory. And it's exactly at this point that we reach something even deeper, the decision that disarmed the enemy. When everyone expected an explosive reaction, the choice was the opposite: silence. And that silence wasn't cowardice, but awareness. The enemy was waiting for the old pattern, that automatic response loaded with anger, pain, or vengeance. But suddenly the chain broke. There was no shout, no blow, just a silent no to everything that had always kept the soul captive. This is where the spiritual game changes. The adversary is strategic. He feeds on repetition, on wounds passed down from generation to generation. Every uncontrolled reaction is like gasoline poured on a fire. But when the chosen one decides not to repeat the cycle, they don't just put out the flame, they dismantle the entire strategy. The decision to pause is more powerful than any fiery speech. This kind of attitude seems fragile to human eyes, but it is precisely the strength that disarms the enemy. It's like a chess game. The most unexpected move confuses the opponent. Instead of repeating predictable moves, the conscious choice interrupts the script that was already written. And at that moment, heaven rises in favor of the one who dared to act differently. The Bible shows this clearly. Jesus, faced with accusations, could have defended himself with sharp words, but chose silence. And in that silence was the authority that disarmed all of hell. Similarly, when someone today decides not to retaliate, not to feed gossip, not to perpetuate grudges, that gesture echoes as a declaration of spiritual sovereignty. That's why silence isn't empty. It's full of meaning. It shouts to the spiritual world, the chain ends here. And that declaration, though not spoken aloud, is heard like thunder in the invisible. This is the kind of decision that doesn't just change a moment, but repositions an entire life. Thus, the enemy is left with no arguments. He expected a reaction and found serenity. He set traps but got no response. This is the power of the unexpected. And it's right here that we come to something even more extraordinary. Silence, seen as weakness by men, is actually the most powerful weapon in spiritual warfare. To those watching from the outside, silence may seem like just the absence of sound, but in the spiritual world, it's a shout that shakes invisible structures. The enemy expected outbursts of anger, sharp words, endless accusations, but found stillness. And that stillness, so despised by men, was interpreted by heaven as authority. Silence became a sword, and every second of it tore through ancient veils. It wasn't an empty silence, but one charged with intention. It's like when a mother chooses not to respond to her rebellious child's provocations, not out of indifference, but because she understands that wisdom lies in not feeding chaos. That silence is maturity, sovereignty, a wordless declaration. I no longer belong to this cycle. And when that decision is made, the spiritual realm reacts immediately. Some may think silence is a sign of weakness, but the truth is it requires more strength than any aggressive response. Controlling the tongue is harder than raising the voice. It's like holding back a dam so the waters don't overflow. The effort is immense, but the result is peace. And it was exactly this that marked a turning point: silence as a shield. Heaven heard this gesture not as passivity, but as warfare. Imagine trumpets sounding without noise, armies marching without visible steps. Silence echoes on that level. It dismantles structures, topples fortresses, and makes way for the freedom that has long been awaited. Those watching from the outside may not understand, but those who live it know there is power in that choice. This kind of decision changes destiny. It was there in the moment when nothing was said that centuries of pain began to dissolve. Silence healed what words could never reach. It didn't just end arguments, it opened a new spiritual narrative in which the chosen one begins to write their story with new ink. And it's precisely at this moment, when silence becomes a sword, that an even deeper revelation emerges. It wasn't just a pause in the present, but a break with pacts of the past. This is where the invisible reveals its greatest secret: the breaking of ancestral contracts. Many carry burdens they never chose. Invisible weights, emotional and spiritual inheritances that span generations. They are contracts never signed but binding as if they were. Guilt, shame, poverty, rejection. How many families repeat the same patterns as if it were an inevitable fate? But the chosen one, by saying enough within themselves, broke chains that had been forged for centuries. This breakthrough didn't happen with external rituals, but with an intimate decision. It's like someone who realizes they no longer need to carry the heavy backpack they've always worn. They just drop it and walk lightly. In the spiritual world, this gesture is seen as a formal refusal of unjust contracts, and by inwardly rejecting those bonds, the chosen one decreed freedom. When a contract is broken, the effects are immediate. What seemed to repeat automatically, divorces, addictions, bankruptcies, emotional illnesses, loses its strength. The enemy loses the legal ground to keep acting. It's like a paid debt. The collector may insist, but they no longer have the right to demand. This is the power of spiritual breakthrough. The greatness of this act is that it doesn't just benefit the one who made the decision. Future generations begin to be born in a clean field, free from ancient prisons. It's like someone paying off a family's entire debt. Children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren no longer have to live under the same yoke. That's why this breakthrough has eternal value. The most surprising thing is that it all started with something simple, an invisible movement, a silence that disarmed an inner decision. This shows that grand ceremonies aren't needed to change destinies, but courage and faith are. The chosen one becomes a living witness that God honors those who choose to break free. And when those contracts are broken, something even greater begins to happen. The old spiritual system collapses. Structures that seemed indestructible start to crumble before the resolve of someone who dared to say no. And it's at this point that a new identity begins to emerge, ready to rewrite the history of an entire lineage. When resistance became firm, what once seemed unshakable began to crumble. It was as if a wall built over centuries of pain and pacts had received its first crack. The enemy didn't expect someone could simply refuse to give in to provocations. That inner no was like spiritual dynamite, blasting invisible foundations. The old system began to collapse before heaven's eyes. Every betrayal, sabotage, or disguised attack was merely a defense mechanism of that old contract. But the chosen one didn't let themselves be bound by them. By not reacting, they exposed the emptiness of those structures, showing that it was all just an illusion sustained by fear. The collapse was inevitable because there was no longer energy to keep the cycle standing. It's interesting to think that collapse often feels scary. When something falls apart, the first sensation is loss, chaos, instability. But here, the collapse wasn't destruction. It was liberation. It was like tearing down a prison to finally breathe fresh air. The old system only existed because it found someone to perpetuate it. Without response, without reaction, it couldn't withstand. The enemy, used to manipulating through pain, found himself without ground. His strategy relied on repeating wounds, but when the pattern was broken, the house of cards fell. God allowed everything to come down because it was time to build something new. The void left by the collapse wasn't ruin, but space for a fresh start. This rupture opens doors to new possibilities. What was once impossible now becomes viable. The identity marked by old guilts gives way to a new, fresh, clean consciousness, ready to receive greater promises. The collapse was just the prelude to a rebirth. And it was precisely in this spiritual void that a new voice echoed in the invisible. God declaring the rise of a new leadership, a heavenly decree that would forever change the destiny of the chosen one and their lineage. In the midst of silence and the breaking of contracts, a voice rose in heaven. It wasn't the voice of man or the enemy, but the voice of God decreeing something entirely new. This is the time for my chosen one to take up leadership. It wasn't a blood inheritance or human privilege, but a divine decision. The one who once seemed fragile was now recognized as a spiritual authority. This leadership isn't about titles or external positions, but about awakened consciousness. The chosen one becomes a reference because they dared to break everything that bound their lineage. They didn't inherit golden thrones, but earned the right to lead by example. Authority came from the silence that disarmed the enemy and the collapse that broke the system. God's decree is irrevocable. Once pronounced, no one can annul it. It's like when Joseph was raised up in Egypt. No matter the accusations, imprisonments, or betrayals, the Lord's word placed him in a position of leadership. So it is with the one who chose to resist. Even without titles, the spiritual realm recognizes them as a ruler. This new leadership is marked by responsibility. It's not just about personal victory, but about carrying an entire lineage toward freedom. Every choice, every sacrifice, every act of faith becomes a guide for others. The chosen one isn't a leader by chance, but because they accepted the mission to transform pain into a reference. It's astonishing how it all began so discreetly. An invisible movement, an unexpected silence, an inner breakthrough. And now the result is an authority that echoes beyond generations. God's decree transforms an ordinary person into a spiritual milestone. The world may not recognize it, but heaven has sealed the new identity. And it's at this point that the impact overflows. The chosen one's breakthrough no longer serves just their own story, but becomes a spiritual reference for all who come after. What seemed isolated now reveals itself as a legacy. Suddenly, what seemed like just a personal victory became a milestone for everyone around. The rupture wasn't limited to the chosen one's life, but opened a visible path in the invisible for others to walk as well. Now, every time someone in the lineage is tempted to repeat old patterns, they'll find a powerful reminder. Someone already said no and won. That spiritual memory serves as an anchor. It's not just about breaking chains, it's about becoming a sign for others. The chosen one transforms into a kind of lighthouse in the darkness, proving there is a way out. Like a pioneer building the first road through a dense forest, they paved a path that makes the journey easier for those who follow. The breakthrough ceases to be individual and becomes collective. The reference created in the spiritual realm acts as a silent testimony. Descendants, even without knowing the details, sense that something is different in the air. It's like being born in an environment where peace has replaced chaos. The fruits are different because the root was transformed. The solitary decision became an inheritance. This kind of reference cannot be erased. Whenever a mind tries to revert to the old contract, the heavenly record will remind them that pattern has already been broken. It's as if heaven sealed the victory in an eternal book, making it visible so no one can doubt. And no matter how temptations try to reopen old doors, they no longer have a key. This new milestone reconfigures the entire lineage. The chosen one, once just another in the crowd, becomes the exception that changes the rule. They stop carrying the shadow of the past and start carrying a torch of reference, illuminating the destiny of all. The impact transcends the limits of their life and produces fruit that will echo for centuries. And it's exactly at this point that the true challenge arises, walking in a territory with no inherited maps. The rupture not only brought freedom, but also the call to forge new paths without ready-made scripts or old guides. The conquered freedom is powerful, but also daunting. The chosen one now stands before an entirely new territory with no prior references. There are no traditions to follow, no clear examples of how to act. It's like walking in uncharted land where every step must be decided with wisdom and faith. This feeling of loneliness is real, but part of the process. Without inherited maps, the mind seeks quick answers but doesn't always find them. This is when relying entirely on God becomes crucial. He is the one who reveals routes yet to be charted. It's like Abraham hearing the call to leave his land without knowing where he was going, trusting that the Creator would guide every detail. That trust becomes a compass. The new territory brings unfamiliarity. The absence of chaos can feel strange, like silence after a storm. Those who have always lived in turmoil find calm unsettling, but that's exactly where healing begins. The challenge is accepting that peace is also part of the chosen one's identity, and that requires relearning how to live without relying on noise. There are moments when the lack of maps creates fear, but that fear can be transformed into opportunity. Instead of seeking old paths, the chosen one begins to create new trails. It's in this boldness that new ideas, new projects, new relationships emerge. The unknown territory becomes fertile ground for a completely different future. It's important to understand that there is no failure in this journey. Every step taken in faith is a spiritual construction. Even if it seems small, it's like planting a stake that marks a new space. That's the beauty of the process. Every movement creates history. The chosen one doesn't follow old maps, but draws new ones. And this journey, though full of uncertainties, is the clearest proof that the rupture was real. Because those who walk in uncharted lands carry the mark of someone who didn't just survive, but inaugurated a new era. And this leads us to an even deeper revelation. The strangeness of this new land isn't a sign of error, but of conquest. The silence after the battle always feels strange. Those who spent their entire lives dealing with chaos, fights, and conflicts feel out of place when they find peace. It's like someone who lived years near a train track and upon moving to the countryside can't sleep because the noise is gone. The chosen one now lives this same discomfort, a new, almost unknown peace. This peace doesn't mean the absence of movement, but a change in frequency. The heart, once accustomed to war, now beats to a different rhythm. It's like learning a new melody after years of hearing only dissonance. This inner music may feel strange at first, but soon reveals itself as the true identity God had planned from the beginning. It's not coldness or indifference, it's spiritual mastery. The chosen one has learned to pass through fire without burning their essence. They've learned to hear provocations without being dragged down. It's a state where attacks lose their power, not because they don't exist, but because they no longer find space to provoke a reaction. This is the true fruit of the rupture. The new land brings a sense of starting over. Everything is new, everything feels different. The old noises that once filled the mind no longer have access. It's like switching radio stations. The old sounds still exist, but are no longer part of the frequency. This is the silent but profound victory of the chosen one. This state requires adaptation. The mind, used to fighting, must now learn to rest. Faith, once used only as a defensive weapon, becomes a guide for creation. Silence stops being just a strategy and becomes a home. It's in this space that the chosen one learns to govern their new reality. And while this adaptation happens, something even greater begins to reveal itself. Every step taken in this unknown territory becomes a creative act, inaugurating a new spiritual territory. Now, every movement is like planting a seed in virgin soil. The old ground, marked by chains and prisons, has been torn down. The remaining space is vast, clean, ready to be cultivated. The chosen one doesn't just walk, they create. Every decision, every gesture, every conscious choice becomes a brick in an invisible construction. The silence of this phase isn't empty, but a fertile field. It's where roots deepen, even unseen. What seemed like a lack of action is, in fact, intense preparation. God works in this silence, aligning paths, connecting opportunities, strengthening foundations that will sustain an eternal legacy. Creating a new spiritual territory is like drawing a map that didn't exist. There are no references, only divine direction. This is where faith becomes the greatest tool for construction. Instead of repeating the old, the chosen one writes new pages, guided by inspiration that can only come from above. This process may seem slow, but it's solid. It's not about building something that will be easily shaken, but about raising pillars that will withstand time. With every step, a milestone is set. With every choice for good, an invisible wall rises in defense. With every sacrifice, a foundation is strengthened. It's important to note that this construction isn't limited to the present. What's being built now will be an inheritance for future generations. The fruits of this creation don't end in one life, but multiply in future lineages. It's a legacy that spans centuries, and so the chosen one stops merely surviving and becomes a pioneer. Their journey opens space for divine favor that will soon manifest, because every invisible act, every silent choice is a stone placed in an eternal construction. Few realize that the greatest spiritual building isn't made of concrete, but of hidden attitudes. Every sacrifice no one applauded, every forgiveness given in silence, every choice for love over resentment, all these add up as bricks in an invisible architecture. To human eyes, nothing changed, but in the spiritual world, a fortress of integrity has been raised. This construction is slow but firm. There's no rush for those who understand that God's time isn't measured by human clocks. One choice today, another tomorrow, another years later, until suddenly a portal opens, and what seemed like wasted effort reveals itself as the foundation for a season of favor. The invisible becomes the base for the visible. Favor doesn't come by chance. It's the consequence of this silent construction. When unexpected doors open, when unlikely connections happen, when opportunities arise without human effort, it's all the fruit of the invisible construction. Those who plant in secret reap in public. It's the principle Jesus taught. What is done in secret, God rewards openly. Practical examples are everywhere. Think of someone who, instead of responding with hatred, chose to pray for their offender. That gesture, though ignored by the world, was recorded as a spiritual brick. Or someone who, despite exhaustion, chose to discreetly help someone in need. All of this generates favor because heaven recognizes the purity of intentions. It's in this dynamic that the true power of integrity is revealed. It's not about seeking recognition, but about building something that sustains generations. With every right decision made in silence, a solid foundation is created upon which heaven pours out grace. Divine favor manifests like rain on fertile ground no one imagined, and this silent movement prepares the ground for something even grander, an immortal legacy, because it's not enough to build just for oneself. What was raised in secret must transcend time and shape the destiny of all who come after. What began as an almost unnoticed gesture turned into an eternal inheritance. The chosen one not only broke contracts and inaugurated a new territory, but left a mark that can never be erased. What seemed like a delay was actually divine redirection. Now the entire history of the lineage has been redesigned. This legacy is immortal because it isn't limited to one life. It spans generations, influencing children, grandchildren, and even those yet to be born. Every time someone faces the temptation to repeat old patterns, they'll find in the invisible a reminder that victory has already been recorded. The breakthrough became an eternal lighthouse. It's astonishing to think that something so silent can echo forever. But that's how God works, using the improbable to confound the predictable. A simple no to resentment becomes a yes to a free destiny. The invisible not only liberated an individual, but reconfigured a collective destiny. This kind of legacy isn't passed down through material inheritance, but through a spiritual atmosphere. Where there was once weight, there is now lightness. Where there was shame, there is now honor. Where misery reigned, abundance now flourishes. All because someone had the courage to break the cycle and become a reference of faith. And the most beautiful thing is that this immortal legacy carries the name of the one who dared to be different. The chosen one is remembered not for what they suffered, but for what they built. Their mark spans centuries as living proof that the invisible is more powerful than any visible chain. Thus, the invisible movement doesn't end, it multiplies. What began as a secret before God now echoes as an eternal inheritance for all who will come. This is the true power of the invisible, turning a simple gesture into eternity. To know that you've made it this far, comment below this video with the keyword freedom. Also share this content with someone you love who needs to hear this message today. What did you feel when you realized that small invisible gestures can change entire destinies? Have you experienced something similar? I want you to share your story in the comments because your experience can inspire many people. And before you leave, click now on the video that appears on the screen and dive even deeper into this journey toward your own purpose.